This is Minjir, a small village in Moldova located a 30-minute drive from the border with the European Union. Once upon a time, this place attracted a lot of attention, but not because of the vineyards or attractions, but because of the willingness of residents to sell their organs. It sounds terrible, but in the 90s of the last century, the people of Moldova became so impoverished that the sale of organs really became widespread. And it seems that this story is repeating itself now. There is a known case where 16 men were voluntarily transported to Turkey at once, where their kidneys were transplanted to patients from the UK, Canada, and Israel. When they recovered from the operation, each man received only $2,000, after which they were quickly sent home. Of the 16 people, 2 died from complications, and the rest acquired expensive treatment to prolong their lives. But the worst thing is that Moldovans spent the money earned in this way on absolutely basic goods: food, clothes, and furniture. The exact figures are unknown, but according to some reports, 130 people in a village with a population of less than 5,000 people sold their kidneys. That is about 1/38 of the villagers. How desperate does a person have to be to decide to sell a body part? How devastated does the economy have to be for this to become widespread? By the beginning of the 21st century, Moldova had probably experienced the most serious decline in peacetime living standards and economic output among all countries in modern history. The country's GDP has fallen by almost a third compared to 1990 levels, amounting to only $400 per capita, as in the poorest regions of the earth. But Moldova's economic failures did not end there. In 2014, the country found itself at the epicenter of one of the largest financial scandals in history. $1 billion has disappeared from one of the 3 largest banks. This is an amount equivalent to an eighth of the entire Moldovan economy. And what is most surprising, the organizers of this robbery have still not been punished. Ilan Shor is a Moldovan businessman and politician, the organizer of the theft. After these events, he was even elected mayor of a city north of the capital. And Vladimir Plahotniuc, a former deputy and oligarch, was tried in many fraud cases but was never convicted, lived safely in the United States, and then in Cyprus. To mitigate the financial consequences, the National Bank issued 25-year bonds worth $870 million. This means that the population of Moldova, which is already the poorest in Europe, has borne and will continue to bear the financial burden until 2039. But it wasn't always like that. Moldova was once a relatively prosperous part of the Soviet Union and a center of agriculture. Moldova specialized in high-tech manufacturing for aerospace and military industries. Its citizens had stable jobs, children had access to quality education, and Moldova's beautiful nature was a popular vacation destination for the Soviet elite. And how did it happen that this country, located on the richest continent, came to total poverty? Look at the map. This red spot is the territory of Bessarabia, a historical region located between the Prut and Dniester rivers. And these territories have gone through a lot of changes. In the 10th century, they were part of Kievan Rus. In the 15th century, they became part of the Moldavian Principality, then the Ottoman Empire, and later the Russian Empire. From 1918 to 1940, Bessarabia was in the possession of Romania. And after 1940, the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was formed on this territory as part of the USSR. And it was an important period for the history of the future Moldova because it was within the USSR that these lands finally began to develop. Do you know what state Bessarabia was in after leaving Romania? Only 30% of the population was literate. The infrastructure of Bala was undeveloped, so rains often made roads impassable, and industry was practically absent. The acute overpopulation of rural areas exacerbated the problems, as the divided land plots were barely enough for households to survive. And it's hard to imagine, but in just a few decades, this place will really become the center of agriculture and high-tech production. But before the Soviets could begin to implement their grandiose plans in Bessarabia, the Germans launched the largest land invasion of the Soviet Union in the history of mankind. And it was only in 1994 that the USSR conquered the Moldovan lands. After the Second World War, the infrastructure of Bessarabia was simply destroyed. Numerous military operations devastated agricultural land, destroyed half of all livestock, and displaced hundreds of thousands of families. After the end of the war, the central part of Bessarabia was united with the westernmost part of the autonomous Moldavian Republic, known as Transnistria, forming the new Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. The remaining territories, which were considered the most strategically important, were then transferred to the Ukrainian Republic. What happened next? By the early 1950s, political and economic turmoil began to subside as Moldova quickly became a well-integrated component of the Soviet state. The USSR authorities developed a plan to turn Moldova into an agricultural giant, because it did not have significant reserves of natural resources, but it had extremely fertile lands. 75% of the country's territory was covered with Chernozem soils, the most fertile in the world. Huge amounts of capital, labor, and technical resources have been invested in state-owned farms. And with the advent of fertilizers, machinery, and new agricultural models, production began to grow rapidly. The country occupied only 0.2% of the territory of the Soviet Union, but at the same time produced 4.2% of vegetables, 12.3% of fruits, 10% of canned food, and 50% of wine. At its peak, Moldova accounted for 30% of the world's tobacco production and 20% of the world's grape harvest. Along with the construction of modern infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and power plants, the quality of life of the population has improved rapidly. Illiteracy was eliminated and life expectancy increased by 10 years. In addition to the 1960s, industry began to actively develop, from tractor construction to textile production. And later, the deployment of the Soviet army in the east of Moldova stimulated the development of related industries, turning the region into a key supplier of weapons, equipment, and components. Please note that the bulk of these new production facilities were located in Transnistria, where 90% of all electricity in the republic was produced and 40% of industrial production was concentrated. But with the influx of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russian specialists to work at new factories, Moldova was increasingly divided into two separate regions. Bessarabia was predominantly rural, agrarian, and its inhabitants spoke Romanian, and Transnistria was more industrially developed, urban, and Russian-speaking. And what do you think it led to? The part of the Moldovan Republic that spoke Romanian began to strive for reunification with Romania, and in the late 1980s, the Popular Front emerged, which united various political factions in opposition to the Communist Party. In August 1989, a Popular Front rally gathered 500,000 people demanding the restoration of Moldova's sovereignty. By 1990, the Popular Front had gained a majority in the Supreme Council of Moldova, ending the communist monopoly on power. And shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova declared its independence on August 27, 1991. But did they need this independence? The Popular Front's program was initially based on the idea that the lands of Bessarabia should be reunited with Romania, and in fact, Moldova needed sovereignty mainly for this. Romania was also not against this idea, and everything was moving towards the unification of these countries. But serious unrest began inside Moldova, because not everyone dreamed of becoming part of Romania. Representatives of national minorities feared that these changes would end negatively for them. Therefore, 5 administrative regions of the country, inhabited by a Turkish-speaking minority known as Gagaz, declared their independence from Moldova. 2 months later, Transnistria followed suit. But the dispute with the Gagaz people was eventually settled peacefully, as the Moldovan government granted them a significant degree of autonomy. But the same scheme did not work with Transnistria. They rejected the offer. Transnistria had a well-developed industry, a predominantly Russian-speaking population lived there, and there was no need for them to join Romania. And Moldova desperately did not want to let go of these territories because the entire economy and infrastructure of the country hung over them. By 1992, separate military clashes between these territories had escalated into a full-scale war. Moldovan troops, initially successful, were forced out of Transnistria when the former Soviet army, now under Russian control, intervened on behalf of Transnistria. All this turned out to be a disaster for Moldova. The loss of Transnistria meant the loss of a significant part of its industrial base and 90% of energy production. Moreover, almost all commercial infrastructure, including railway lines, pipelines, roads, and access to the region's most important port, passed through Transnistria, which was now inaccessible. And all this happened exactly when Moldova's economic system was in decline. For the previous 50 years, Moldova's economy depended on exporting its agricultural products to other countries of the Soviet Union, and at the same time it received very cheap raw materials, fuel, and financing for its public services. But what happened to this scheme when it gained independence? It is logical that the country's economy continued to rely on the usual flow of goods, but with one big difference. It was no longer a domestic trade, but an international one. This means that Moldova was now forced to trade with less favorable taxes and customs rules, but she can no longer receive raw materials at prices below world prices. In just 1 year, the cost of importing gasoline and natural gas increased 40 times, and coal imports increased 100 times. This was a huge change for the economy, and Moldova was not ready for this. Decades of subsidizing energy prices led to the fact that the country was left with extremely inefficient industries, utilities, and farms. And what about the unification with Romania? The idea, so championed by the supporters of the Popular Front, had simply disappeared. Moldovans feared political chaos in the country, and the idea of unification quickly became unpopular. By 1994, 90% of Moldovans voted to preserve the country's independence. But this independence has only led to the fact that almost the entire economy of Moldova has become unviable. GDP has fallen by an average of 12.9% annually for 8 consecutive years. Inflation soared to 2,000%, and by the end of the decade, exports and real wages were only a quarter of the 1990 level. As government revenues declined, spending also had to be cut sharply. By 1998, annual spending on healthcare per capita had dropped to $20, on education to $31, and on Social Security to $18. The economic downturn, combined with rampant tax evasion, has led to a rapid increase in public debt. Moldova's economy has reached the bottom, but it was at that moment that the country faced another external shock. In August 1998, Russia defaulted on its debts, which caused a serious financial crisis and economic downturn. Moldova, although it became independent from Russia, has done little to diversify its trade. On the eve of the crisis, 68% of all Moldovan exports were still directed to Russia. Immediately after the default, the total volume of exports decreased by 50%. The currency lost 50% of its value, which led to a doubling of external debt to 106% of GDP. By 2000, Moldova was undoubtedly the poorest country in Europe. 60% of its population lived on less than 65 cents a day, as a result of which the average daily calorie intake plummeted from almost 3,000 calories to 1,900 calories. Among the 60 countries surveyed by the World Value Survey, Moldova was the least happy country. A massive outflow of the population has begun, including young qualified people who are so necessary for economic recovery, tried their best to leave the country. Look at the scale of migration. In 1992, 4.3 million people lived in Moldova, and in 2023, there are only 2.5 million left. The population has almost halved. Moldova has become a leader among post-Soviet countries in terms of population outflow, and those who stayed probably find solace in alcohol, because in terms of alcohol consumption per capita, this country is also one of the first places in the world. Desperate for an improvement in the situation, Moldova became the first and only post-Soviet state to return the Communist Party to power in 2001. Having received 50% of the votes and 71% of the seats in parliament, the Communists, led by Vladimir Voronin, sought to bring the country closer to Russia. This step was dictated by the hopes of solving the Transnistrian problem and achieving better trade conditions. Negotiations with Putin on Transnistria initially went smoothly, and both sides came to a consensus on the terms. But on the eve of signing the agreement, demonstrations inside the country and pressure from the EU forced Voronin to abandon the deal. Putin responded by renouncing all future commitments to withdraw Russian troops from Transnistria. What happened next? Having failed to get closer to Russia, Voronin turned his face to the West, expressing a desire to integrate into the European Union, which at that time seemed impossible to many. But people liked the dream of European prosperity so much that they decided to give their votes to Voronin again in the 2005 elections. However, his working methods were far from European values. During its second term, the Communist Party expanded its control over Moldovan society. Journalists were harassed, the media was restrained by censorship, judges were replaced by party supporters, and political opponents were intimidated. The party used its power to take bribes from the population and transferred state assets to itself, its families, and its supporters. For example, Voronin's son, Oleg, magically became the most successful businessman in the country, having a hand in all aspects of the economy, including construction, finance, transport, supermarkets, restaurants, and car dealerships. However, Voronin was far from the first to initiate widespread corruption in the country. All the valuable assets of Moldova went to a select few, and the people continued to get poorer. Politicians teamed up with oligarchs, changed laws in their own interest, and bribed the police and judges to avoid prosecution. Over the past 30 years, Moldova has consistently been among the most corrupt post-Soviet states. Even after the communists ceded power to pro-Western political parties in 2009, those who came to power increased corruption even more. It was during that period that $1 billion were stolen from Moldovan banks. In 2014, Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor secretly acquired controlling stakes in 3 of the country's largest banks. After this acquisition, banks began to issue fictitious loans to Moldovan companies also associated with Shor. The funds were then transferred through a number of shell companies, mainly in the UK and Hong Kong, and eventually ended up in Latvian banks. Thus, a total of $1 billion was stolen from the country, after which Moldova was gripped by a crisis and total impoverishment of the population. Apparently, the advent of democracy and independence did not improve the situation of the republic at all. What kind of future awaits a country with such a contradictory history? In October 2024, the next presidential elections will be held in Moldova, simultaneously with the referendum on the country's ascension to the European Union. In the same year, the Moldovan parliament adopted a law on postal voting in elections so that Moldovans living in other countries could also choose the president of Moldova. However, the list of countries admitted to such a vote is surprising. The United States, Canada, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. It turns out that Moldovans living in post-Soviet countries were not allowed to participate in these elections. The current president of Moldova, Maia Sandu, bans media outlets that criticize the government and does not allow the opposition to participate in the elections. But she continues to assert that the opinion of the people is important. And what do you think the upcoming elections in Moldova will lead to? And will this exhausted, poor country become part of Romania and the European Union? Write your thoughts in the comments.